Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Aylmer lecture, this year's main lecture for the history department. I'm Ollie Benish, I'm the head of the history department. The Aylmer lecture, this I believe is the 22nd annual Aylmer lecture. The first one I think was in 2003. And I think we missed one in 2020 due to some things going on at that point. But Gerald Aylmer was the founding kind of professor of history here at the University of Warwick. He arrived in 1962 and was head of department for 15 years. Hopefully the relief of my colleagues, I don't have that sort of energy. I've got about 3 years and 3 months left. But what I did want to just mention, Gerald Aylmer, when he passed away in 2000, phenomenal historian at York and then Oxford, and he passed away in 2000. There was a movement to kind of have this annual lecture in his honor, which then started a couple of years later. We've had a fantastic array of historians. We usually kind of have a medieval historian, then kind of an early modern, and a modern historian in that kind of order. So this year it's a fantastic honor to have one of the leading early modern historians to give the lecture. And so to introduce the chair of the lecture this year, it's my great honor to introduce my colleague, Professor Helen Cowie, who is an early modern historian, began as a historian of Latin America, especially kind of science and empire, and then moved into animals, and is now, one of the, if not kind of the leading animal historians in the world.
That's a very big claim.
I can back it up. And so, without further ado, I will hand over to Helen.
Thank you very much, Alec. No, it's not. Is this working? I hope people can hear me. Okay, so it's my absolute pleasure to introduce this year's Aylmer lecture speaker, Professor Rebecca Earle. Rebecca is Professor of History at the University of Warwick, where she researches and teaches the history of Latin America. She's published widely on an incredibly diverse range of topics, from Castor paintings in colonial Spanish America to the writing of national histories in the post-independence period. But most recently, she's focused on the history of food and its cultural significance. Rebecca is the author of 5 books, several of which will be very familiar to many of my students, if any of them are in here today. Her first book, Spain and the Independence of Colombia, examined the collapse of Spanish colonialism in early 19th century Colombia. Her second monograph, The Return of the Native, offered a hemispheric introduction of elite nationalism in post-colonial Spanish America, charting shifting perceptions of the indigenous American past. Rebecca's third monograph, The Body of the Conquistador, went back to the 16th and 17th centuries to explore how food and eating shaped the experience of colonialism in Spanish America. It shows how specific foods quickly became markers of ethnic identity, and it charts Spanish colonists' concerns that if they consumed indigenous foods, things like maize tortillas or perhaps the odd guinea pig or iguana, that they would in effect become Indians. This book won the Conference on Latin American History's Bolton Johnson Prize, which is a very prestigious award. Most recently, Rebecca has published 2 absolutely fantastic books on the potato. The first of these, called Potato, with Bloomsbury in 2019, and the second, called Feeding the People, The Politics of the Potato. This came out with Cambridge University Press in 2020. Featuring chapters on immigrant potatoes, enlightened potatoes, and capitalist potatoes. This book uses the humble potato to explore broader global concerns about diet, nutrition, and food security. And also, something I really like is to highlight the global reach of the potato. Each chapter of the book includes a recipe involving a potato from all around the world, from Sichuan stir-fried potatoes to Russian baked potatoes. And lastly, as well as producing such engaging and thought-producing research, Rebecca is also an incredibly generous human being. She's been a big support and inspiration to me when I was completing my PhD at the University of Warwick, and she still regularly sends me wonderful little tidbits about llamas and guinea pigs. Even today, we've been talking about llamas that Rebecca's uncovered in the archive, which is hugely appreciated. So, without further ado, it's a real pleasure to be able to welcome Rebecca to York today, and I very much look forward to hearing about her current research project, which is called Captured at Sea, Piracy, Prize and the Circulation of Art in Early Modern Europe. So please join me in welcoming Rebecca.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here. It sounds to me like my microphone is working extremely well. Is that, I gather it is. So, well, let me talk to you a little bit about a topic that has nothing particular to do with either food or, well, it does have to do with the history of Latin America, but has become something that I've become very interested in. And I want to start with a little example of a picture. So here we have a picture from colonial Mexico. It's called View of the Main Plaza in Mexico City. It is one of the largest paintings that was ever produced in colonial Mexico, aside from religious works that were supposed to hang in cathedrals. It was painted around 1695 by the Mexican artist Cristobal del Villalpando, and it's nearly 4 square meters in size. It's really very big. And it offers, as you can see, a bird's eye view of Mexico City's dynamic urban scene. And today it's widely reproduced in books about colonial Spanish America. Maybe I've got some examples of books showing, using it as a cover. And it's considered a canonical representation of colonial Mexico, as well as perhaps the artist's finest work. So very Mexican, very embedded in the history of Mexico. So it's perhaps surprising that this painting spent extremely little time in Mexico. Within 2 decades of its having been painted, it had arrived in Britain. It today hangs in the library at Corsham Court, which is a stately home in Wiltshire that belongs to the Methuen family, and it's hung there ever since. Well, it's hung that particular site since the middle of the 18th century. It's been in Britain since the early 18th century. And the Methuens are far from being the only members of Britain's 18th century elite who owned an enormous painting of a colonial Spanish-American city. For example, the Hulse family in Hampshire owned an even larger Mexican painting. There it is. It's called the New Year's Eve celebration in Mexico from 1720. And in fact shows a scene, again, Mexico City Central Plaza, almost identical to the one in the previous painting, rotated 90 degrees. It's the same sort of view of Mexico City. So how do these quintessentially Mexican paintings come to hang on the walls of English country estates? Well, the first one that I showed you, the one that belonged to Sir Paul Methuen, that was purchased by him in Spain during a residency when he was there on a little diplomatic mission. But the Hulse family painting, this one here, was captured at sea, at least according to the Hulse family's legend. This supremely Mexican picture was taken from a Spanish ship by an English privateer in the 17th century. And this painting is one of a number of artworks from colonial Spanish America that was said to have been captured at sea by pirates or privateers in the 17th or 18th century. And so what I want to do today in this talk is examine the role of pirates and privateers and ships in general in circulating art during this period. And I'm going to use paintings from colonial Spanish America as a case study to illustrate this phenomenon. So that's my topic, the idea of pirates or other people aboard ship capturing works of art and moving them around Europe. So I want to start by stories of art being captured at sea. I'll give you some other examples of paintings that were supposedly captured at sea. And I'll then try to explain why these stories were so popular given that, as I'll also try to show, they're often completely wrong. So that's the first thing I want to do. The reason, to give you some sense of where this is going to go, the reason in part is because English privateers and pirates, privateers were basically pirates who had a legal document from the government allowing them to engage in piracy. They were frequently seen as patriotic figures whose attacks on the Spanish Empire resonated with growing English and then subsequently British nationalism. So from this perspective, stories of enormous Mexican paintings captured at sea reflect wonderfully the romanticized vision of British maritime supremacy, but they tell us relatively little about how these pictures actually ended up in the UK. So I'm then going to turn from fictional pirates to material reality, because in fact, works of art were regularly captured at sea, whether by pirates or privateers or European navies. Water was the easiest way to transport cargo, and as a result, paintings had for centuries bobbed around on the oceans around Europe and crossing the seas of the world. Once they were at sea, they were vulnerable to seizure. So trade and diplomacy were by no means the only forces that moved art in and out of Europe. Paintings didn't move in and out of Europe simply because they were sent as commercial objects to the destination they were intended, nor because they were given as diplomatic gifts or things like that, which is what scholars have really focused on. The many military conflicts between Britain and France and Spain and the Netherlands, etc., during the 17th and 18th centuries resulted in the capture of thousands of enemy and neutral vessels, and in the case of Britain alone in the late 18th century, the arrival of millions of pounds of merchandise into Britain as a result of these captures at sea. So the remainder of the talk is going to examine the real phenomenon of art being captured at sea. Taking seriously romantic stories about pirates, in fact, sheds historical light on the role of naval conflict in shaping the art scene in early modern Europe, and also in telling us something about the nature of globalization during this period. Scholars have rightly stressed the interconnected global nature of early modernity and the way in which the world was becoming more and more in contact during this period. And very often material culture, that's to say objects, stuff, things, have been used by scholars to trace these interconnections and to give us a material sense of the way in which these interconnections became concrete. If we pay attention to the role of war in circulating global objects, this reminds us, I think, not simply that the world became more global during this period. It also tells us something about the role of war in creating this more globalized world. So that's my plan for what I want to talk about. But let's start with some patriotic pirates, okay? So the first explanation that I've encountered of how the enormous picture that ended up in the Hulse family's collection, the second of the ones that I was showing you. The first explanation that I've found of how it ended up in the UK dates from the mid-19th century. And according to the Victorian art historian Louisa Mary Portman, the painting was, as she put it, taken many years ago on its voyage from Mexico to Spain. And when some other of the Mexican paintings that were also in the collection of the Hulse family were exhibited at an international exhibition in 1912, another member of the Hulse family added a bit more detail to this family legend of how all of these paintings had ended up in their house in Hampshire. And she explained that one of her ancestors, an Admiral Washbro or Westrow, she said, had captured them at sea in the mid-17th century. So there's one example of this story of paintings being captured at sea in the 17th century. Captured at sea is likewise said to have been the origin of a set of paintings. Maybe I've got a picture of them. Oh, that was just to remind you. That's sorry, I should have shown you that slide. There was, just to remind you, there's this little story of it's being captured at sea by some admiral, some relative of theirs. So if we turn to another example of this, we can look at a set of pictures, 8 pictures, depicting the conquest of Mexico that belonged until the middle of the last century to the Cholmondeley family in Yorkshire. There are 8 pictures that depict the conquest of Mexico. They're in fact the earliest known cycle of paintings from colonial Mexico depicting the conquest. So they're quite significant colonial pictures, and showing the overthrow of the Aztec Empire. And up until 1948, they hung at an estate in Howsham Hall in Yorkshire. So how do they get there? Well, again, according to family legend, the set had been acquired in the late 17th century when Sir Hugh Cholmondeley was returning from an ambassadorial posting in Tangiers. His ship had supposedly captured a Dutch vessel that had itself previously captured a Spanish ship whose cargo included these paintings. And like the Hulse family's paintings, these 8 pictures were said to have been destined for the King of Spain. So they weren't just any pictures, they were intended for the king. And a similar provenance was offered for a number of other colonial Mexican pictures circulating around late 18th and early 19th century Britain. I won't go into details here. I hope you've got sort of a sense of the kinds of stories, the kinds of family legends. But I could tell you give you a number of other examples of these captured at sea stories. So the point is that from the late 18th century through to the early 20th century, English owners of colonial Mexican pictures often believed that their paintings were intended for the Spanish monarchy but had been captured at sea by an English ship. Okay? So let's now think about this story, this trope of captured at sea. So let's now think a little bit about pirates, okay? Generally, when I recount these stories, whether to scholars or in fact to anyone else, the pretty universal response is amused derision. And the notion of a painting being captured on the high seas by pirates seems whimsical. Why they would be interested. Wouldn't they just throw this stuff overboard as zero interest is kind of one of the questions. So, sorry?
Sorry. Well, obviously they're one of the more expensive things on the ship.
Well, so that's what are they? Well, that's a very good point. We will return to this question of exactly this. So, there may seem something sort of peculiar about the idea of pirates or privateers being interested in art. We'll come back to their value. But in any event, central elements of the family histories about how these paintings ended up often simply don't stand up to analysis. We can easily show that they're just plain wrong. So, for example, the paintings in Breamore House that were supposedly captured in the 17th century by an Admiral Westrow or an Admiral Washbrough, that story cannot possibly be correct that these paintings were captured in the mid-17th century since they were painted in the early 18th century. That's easy to establish. And anyway, I found no evidence that there was an Admiral Westrow or an Admiral Washbrough of any sort whatsoever, certainly not a relative of the Hulse family. So that story is just plain out, right? But while there's little evidence that the Hulse family's Mexican paintings were captured at sea in the 17th century by an English privateer, there is ample evidence that stories about such captures were extremely popular in 19th century Britain when these stories about these particular paintings start to emerge. 19th century Britain was awash with literary pirates. They featured in many popular novels and poems, from Lord Byron's 1814, The Corsair, to Sir Walter Scott's 1822, The Pirate, which was quickly made into a whole series of plays, and in fact even a musical version, if I recall correctly, to Robert Louis Stevenson's 1883, Treasure Island, which apparently Prime Minister Gladstone stayed up till 2 in the morning to finish. She found that gripping. There were many plays in which pirates featured as the heroes, performed up and down across the UK. Pirates featured in periodical fiction, in short stories, in musical dramas. And in fact, some of you may be familiar with the Pirates of Penzance, the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, which was a kind of, comedy response to the ubiquity of these sorts of literary pirates. In fact, a pair of scholars, Frederick Berwick and Manushok Powell, counted something like 120 different pirate dramas that featured on British stages over the 19th century. And pirates and privateers had long been popular with English and then British readers and theatre goers. And since the 16th century, ballads had celebrated or at times deplored the activities of pirates and privateers, and they reached a broad audience. Narratives by and about pirates and privateers were widely read and distributed, and as were accounts of their deaths, and reports about the death of a famous pirate. These things were also published and widely read and circulated. Literary pirates were a varied bunch. And scholars have highlighted the ambivalences between different texts and often within individual texts. And some accounts were based more or less loosely on real people, others were a pure invention. And settings for these accounts ranged from the Indian Ocean to the Caribbean, which was the prime setting for most of these accounts. And the Caribbean setting provided a particularly attractive opportunity for British writers to denounce Spanish colonialism. So setting in the Americas provided a chance to represent British colonialism, to represent Spanish colonialism as an unredeemed genocide and massacre and oppression of indigenous peoples, at the same time as it also allowed a celebration of British daring-do in the relieving of the Spanish of the treasures that was being carried on these treasure ships into Britain. And these accounts were popular fare in Britain and had been for some centuries. And I think this sort of approach of the kind of patriotic pirate is beautifully summed up, in fact, by one of the characters in Treasure Island, who comments describing the fictional pirate Captain Flint, who's a character in the novel. And he comments at one point, he says, "Captain Flint," he said, "was the bloodthirstiest buccaneer that sailed. Blackbeard was a child to Flint. The Spaniards were so prodigiously afraid of him that, I tell you, sir, I was sometimes proud he was an Englishman." So I think this gives us a wonderful sense of the power of the capture of a Spanish treasure as being a patriotic venture. So 19th century Britons could draw on hundreds of years of patriotic fiction when constructing explanations for the presence of Spanish-American artworks in the UK. Stories about capture at sea of paintings destined for the Spanish monarch at the Escorial reflect this image of the English privateer as a romantic, patriotic figure singeing the King of Spain's beard, right? So Admiral Westrow and his ilk, he might not have existed, but stories about men like him certainly did. So we can certainly provide, I think, a reasonably robust historical context to explain the emergence in the 19th century of these stories about how these paintings ended up in Britain. So far so good, I think, yeah? We have a little account. So, but let's also not be too quick to dismiss these tales as mere fiction. Because as I was hinting at in the introduction, after all, how else other than by sea were paintings from Spanish America going to reach Europe? I mean, that was the only possible way, right, that they could have traveled. Water, as I said, was generally the most efficient and the most economical form of transport. So paintings were routinely packed into the holds of ships for travel to international destinations, whether within Europe or more globally. So, for example, when a ship that the British referred to as the Crowned Mary of Flushing sailed out of Vlissingen in the Netherlands, heading towards Saint-Malo in 1667, Its cargo consisted of, so a quite ordinary ship making a relatively ordinary journey from the Netherlands to France. What was in its cargo? Its cargo was 2 hampers of frying pans, 5 bags of pepper, 50 barrels of tar, 12 barrels of pitch, 20 cases of tobacco, 150 deal boards, a large number of cables and hawsers, a variety of other goods, and 1 case of pictures. In 1709, a French ship, the Aventure Notre-Dame de Rossaigne et Saint-Antoine, sailed from Lisbon, heading towards Rouen, carrying, among other things, alongside its varied cargo of buckrams and linens and periwigs and some hats and some cider and several cases of red herrings, it carried 6 cases of artwork. One Monsieur Grégoire had shipped, quote, a chest containing 48 prints, and one Mr. Saint-Earle had sent 2 cases containing pictures of the court in gilded frames. And Daniel Bouet had put on board, or had commissioned to be carried, 3 cases packed up containing pictures. So we can find lots of examples of paintings simply being transported in a very ordinary way alongside cases of red herrings and hawsers and bags of tobacco and that sort of thing. And in fact, that meant that the packing of paintings was something that was of enormous importance to the people who were shipping them. There's a whole very interesting history of how people tried to send artworks internationally so that they, survived intact. There's lots of very interesting advice, for example, that if you were sending sculptures, you should pack them in sand. That was the safest way to pack things. And the best thing you could do is you could put your paintings in as large a box as possible to reduce the likelihood that the port staff would hurl it about and damage your artwork. There's a whole side topic. But anyway, paintings were packed in cargoes. Paintings also traveled in the personal luggage of passengers. So, for example, in 1634, when Pedro Munho de Nobergo sailed back to Europe from North Africa, where he had been held a prisoner for 6 years on the North African coast, when he returned to Europe from his captivity, having been ransomed, he carried with him a painting of the Virgin Mary, which he had purchased during his period of servitude and which he brought back with him. Or, for example, when the East India Company official John Saris set sail from London towards Japan in 1614, he brought with him to console himself on the long voyage from Europe to Japan. He carried in his cabin an erotic painting of Venus set in a very large frame, which apparently hung in his cabin throughout the entire journey. So ships carried paintings both as cargo and as the personal possession of passengers on board. And since paintings regularly traveled at sea, which is what I've been trying to suggest, they were regularly captured at sea, whether by pirates or privateers or the navies of Western European countries. By the 18th century, it was accepted in Europe that during periods of warfare, warring states were entitled to seize not only military vessels belonging to their enemies, but mercantile ships and their cargoes as well. That was absolutely standard naval military practice and was in fact an important strategic aim of warfare for commercial and economic war, in a sense, was part of how war was conducted. You tried to weaken the trade of your enemies. And the conventions governing this practice had really evolved from the 13th century or so in Europe. The 13th century saw the emergence of what were called letters of reprisal, which meant that if an Englishman, for example, was unable to resolve a dispute with, let's say, a Frenchman, the English crown might, under certain specific circumstances, issue a letter of reprisal which entitled the holder to seize the belongings of any French person in order to compensate for the loss. And so-called letters of marque, also developed subsequently, and they authorized the confiscation of enemy goods during periods of war. So if you had a letter of marque, that effectively that was what it meant to be a privateer. It meant you could capture an enemy ship if war broke out. Some merchants who were going on merchant journeys took out a letter of marque just in case they happened to encounter an enemy ship that they thought they could capture, and others cruised deliberately looking for things to capture, and those latter were the ones who were really referred to as privateers. But in both cases, this involved not simply military vessels, but as I said, commercial vessels that were just trying to, carry red herrings from Amsterdam to Saint-Malo. Those were legit military targets. On capturing an enemy ship, privateers and naval vessels were supposed to bring it into port so its cargo could be inventoried and then divided up among the crew of the ship that had made the capture, according to that nation's legislation governing naval prize, as such booty was called. Prizes could be considerable. The prize for the capture in the mid-18th century of the Spanish ship Hermione, for example, which was captured by the British in the Philippines during the Seven Years' War, the prize totaled nearly £500,000, which was shared between the officers and the crew. Hyde Parker, who was the captain of one of the ships involved in this action, received something on the order of £10,000, which he used to purchase an estate in Bedfordshire. So to give you a sense of the value of this money. Ordinary seamen got £475 each, which is something on the order of maybe £50,000 today, a great increase over their annual pay of about £14 a year. Right, so you can put that in context. Pirates, too, aim to capture goods at sea. And the difference between pirates and privateers in the Royal Navy was that pirates didn't have the authorization for their action in the form of a letter of marque, and they didn't abide by the legislation about reporting of captures, and they followed their own rules about distribution of prize. But the lines between the two were really very flexible. All three, pirates, privateers, and naval vessels, engaged in capture at sea. All three, therefore, disrupted cargoes from their intended and expected routes and sent them off, into totally unintended trajectories. And as a result of all this activity, all sorts of things ended up in Britain that hadn't been destined to end up in Britain. As I noted a moment ago, capture at sea brought millions of pounds of commodities into the British economy over the late 18th century alone. It was a really significant economic force. So to return to our topic, capture at sea, in particular, regularly disrupted the transport of paintings in the early modern era. Traveling, as one scholar put it, exposed artworks to the friction of distance, to a kind of form of friction, right? Slowing, down travel, and also to the risk of loss or damage. For instance, in 1805, the Scottish art dealer William Buchanan lamented the loss of several of his shipments, which had been captured at sea and taken into Spain. This art dealer complained that the French ship, one of the, for instance, had been carrying £5,000 of his property, including, he wrote, a Juno and an Argus by Rubens, a grand picture from the Durazzo Palace at Genoa, and a very capital picture by Titian from Milan, all of which had been captured by the Spanish and taken into Algeciras. And he wrote eloquently about the loss of these paintings and what this meant to him commercially and financially. A considerable number of the artworks that were acquired by Richard Worsley during a diplomatic stint in Venice ended up in the collection of Lucien Bonaparte when the ship transporting them to Britain was captured by a French privateer. I did everything in my power to redeem your property, but without effect in regard to the pictures, the British consul in Malaga reported sadly to Worsley in 1801. Never got them back. So such seizures were a continual risk during the frequent European conflicts that occurred from the mid-17th to the mid-19th centuries. And so I've in this part of what I've been working on, I've documented a good number of concrete examples of ships that were captured during these conflicts that were found to contain cases of pictures or paintings, sometimes in spectacular quantities. And I won't belabor the point by giving you more examples, but some really massive quantities of Italian art, for example, ended up in places where they hadn't been intended to go to whatsoever. And the legal situation governing captured ships was not always clear and often generated a lot of bad feeling and international disputes. In the UK, this process was determined by the Court of Admiralty, which adjudicated legal matters arising from events at sea, including the capture of foreign ships. Its prize courts met regularly both in Britain and in various cities within the British Empire to determine whether a capture was, as it was called, lawful prize or good prize, or whether, on the other hand, some of the cargo, all of the cargo, or even the ship itself, ought to be returned to the previous owners. And at times, these cases had significant political consequences as well. In 1793, for example, the French privateer, the Général Dumouriez, was captured by the Royal Navy. Now, the French vessel had itself, mere days prior to its capture by the Royal Navy, had captured the Santiago Apostoli, Spanish ship that had been sailing from Peru headed towards Spain. So the Spanish ship had been captured by a French ship, and then the French ship was on short order captured by the British, okay? And the Santiago turned out to be carrying an absolutely phenomenal cargo of over 2 million pesos in gold and silver coin, and a great array of other goods, including a number of pictures. The overall value of this prize was calculated to be nearly £1 million in current money at the time. And these now all fell into British hands. But doubts were soon raised about the legality of this capture. Spain and Britain, in fact, were allies at the time in the fight against revolutionary France. They had recently signed treaties agreeing to protect each other's shipping in the face of French assault. So the Spanish ambassador wasted no time in submitting a request to get his ship back. Right? There were a whole series of complications. The British Admiralty Court conducted complex investigations and concluded years later, perhaps to nobody's surprise, that the capture had been perfectly legitimate, that the £1 million odd of money belonged to Britain. Shortly thereafter, Spain declared war on Britain, citing this case as a precipitating factor. So the capture of this ship, in other words, had significant political consequences. And it also, completely unintentionally, brought a number of Peruvian pictures into Britain. Not that this was what was of particular concern to people at the time, but it was a consequence of these sorts of events. So, to sum up the point that I've been trying to make here, the notion that art might be captured at sea is not simply a romantic fantasy. Paintings did travel by sea, and as a consequence, they were on occasion captured at sea, since the capture of goods at sea was a regular occurrence during the early modern era. Naval prize was at times significant in terms of its value and its impact on geopolitics, and they also moved art around in and out of Europe, drawing artworks into new orbits and disrupting intended trajectories. So let me, in the final part of what I want to talk about, return to where we began, which was the presence of in early modern and 19th century Britain of paintings from colonial Spanish America. Scholars who've been interested in these artworks have in general not expressed very much curiosity about how these artworks ended up in Britain. The attention, almost completely, I think, among scholars who've worked on these paintings has been on their significance within Spanish American history. So, for example, the two enormous plazas of Mexico City that I showed you right at the start, there's much wonderful scholarship on what they tell us about colonial Mexican views about colonial Mexico and about senses of identity and an emergent sense, perhaps, of proto-nationalism in 18th century Mexico. And there's lots of scholarship on these paintings within a Spanish-American context, but effectively nothing on why they're in Britain and what that might tell us. So what I want to suggest is that by questioning why and how they reached Britain, we get some insight not simply into the trajectories of these individual pictures, which might be interesting, but we also gain a fuller understanding of the varied mechanisms whereby art circulated in early modern Europe, which is a point that I'll address in my conclusion in a little while. So, implausible though tales of capture at sea might initially strike us, and much as they may resonate with pervasive anti-Spanish tropes about plucky English pirates, paintings from colonial Spanish America were captured at sea from Spanish treasure ships. So let me offer you, in the sort of final section here, a few more concrete examples, not just of art being captured at sea, but of things being destined for the King of Spain, captured, at sea by English ships. So let me give you one example, or two maybe three. So we'll see how I get on. So in 1806, example number one, a London auction house, the auction house of Cassano, offered a quite unusual item for sale. The catalogue described Lot 23 as a very large Peruvian painting. And it continued, this great piece of art is extremely curious, and it may justly be said unique. It was destined for the court of Madrid. So but it was intercepted on board of the St. Jago register ship bound from Lima to Cadiz in 1793 by the General Dumouriez, French privateer, recaptured by a British squadron. It represents an Indian festival at Lima, the capital of Peru, on the occasion of the ascension of Charles IV, the present sovereign, to the throne of Spain. According to another description, the painting offered a bird's-eye view of the great square of Lima and was said to have been painted by, quote, an untutored native of Peru. So here then was another large picture of the central plaza of a Spanish-American city, perhaps comparable to those by Villalpando and Arellano, the two that I showed you at the start. So perhaps yet another great plaza. And like those two, this picture was said to have been captured from a Spanish vessel while en route to the Spanish court. But indeed, this picture, as you probably worked out by now, had reached Britain through capture at sea. As the advertisement stated, it was part of the substantial prize arising from the capture of the Santiago Apostol, right? The very ship that I was just discussing a moment ago. So first of all, this painting really truly was on board such ship. I found it in the inventory. It's described, indeed, it's very big. It's like 7 meters by 10 or something like that. It's an enormous picture. And it's, not only was it truly captured at sea by, at first by a French privateer and then by the Royal Navy, but moreover, it really truly was destined for the court of Madrid. It had been commissioned, the festivities that it depicted, I don't know why I'm waving at that, I should wave at that, the Indian festival at Lima that it depicts was part of a series of festivities that took place in Peru, in Lima, to celebrate Charles IV becoming King of Spain. And these particular festivities had been paid for by one Bartolomé de Mesa, who was an indigenous man who funded a series of festive processions and parades by the city's indigenous population. And Mesa not only paid for these parades and a bullfight and various things, he paid to have a painting made of the festival that he'd funded, which he had intended to send to the new monarch, Charles IV, as a present to celebrate his coronation. So it was indeed destined for the King of Spain, who, from Mesa's point of view, it sadly never reached, because he had been hoping it would lead to his being promoted, maybe, in the colonial militia or something. He was hoping he'd get something out of it. That man, Mesa, had an interesting story, but be that as it may. This was exactly how this painting reached Britain. Its current whereabouts are unknown. I'm sure it's hanging on the wall of some country estate somewhere in Britain. We don't know what it looked like beyond the written descriptions. It perhaps bore some resemblance to this other picture of the Central Plaza in Lima from roughly 100 years earlier, so we can look at this and imagine that the painting might have looked something like that. So that's example number one. Let's now revisit the 8 pictures of the conquest of Mexico that I also mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the ones that belong to the Cholmondeley family. When, as I mentioned, family stories dating back to the 19th century confirmed that Sir Hugh Cholmondeley had acquired these paintings in the 1670s when he was returning from a diplomatic posting in Tangier. And en route, as I mentioned, his ship was said to have captured a Dutch vessel that carried these paintings, seized without doubt from the Spanish. So as I had noted before, this fits neatly into 19th century British Romanticism of adventures on the high seas based on scant historical evidence, right? But in fact, on his return from Tangier, Sir Hugh's ship was caught up in a naval action off the Isle of Wight in March 1672, in an incident that in fact contributed to the outbreak of the Third Anglo-Dutch War. A small British squadron, totally unprovoked, attacked a Dutch convoy of ships sailing back from Smyrna, the so-called Smyrna convoy of a very large number of Dutch merchant ships carrying silks and mohairs and cottons and spices and a range of other goods, including a number of items from Spanish America. So, and including Sir Hugh's Mexican pictures. And so these may not have been destined for the King of Spain, but they were indeed captured at sea exactly as family legend had recounted. And here's a picture depicting this very action. It was ill-advised, but resulted, at least in these pictures ending up in Britain. Capture at sea, for that matter, in fact, probably to celebrate the unusual picture that he had acquired in this way, Sir Hugh's household staged a performance of John Dryden's drama, The Conquest of Mexico, a few years later, which was exactly one of these patriotic stories. But anyway, capture at sea was likewise how the 16th century Codex Mendoza, another famous piece of early colonial Mexican art, ended up in the Bodleian Library, which is where it is now. The Codex Mendoza is an illustrated account of the Aztec state, which was created in Mexico by indigenous artists in the 1540s. And according to 18th century sources, it was commissioned by the first Mexican viceroy as a gift to the Emperor Charles IV, intended for the King of Spain. While en route from Europe, the vessel in which it was traveled was captured by a French man-of-war who took the cargo to the French court. And it was subsequently purchased by Richard Hakluyt, who was the chaplain to the English ambassador, and he took it to England. It passed through various hands before entering the collections of the Bodleian Library in 1659. So here we have another painting, or set of paintings, if we can consider the Codex Mendoza as such, intended for the King of Spain, captured at sea. So these examples, and there are plenty others, demonstrate, I think, that the presence of artworks from colonial Spanish America and early modern Britain, well, was obviously, what point am I trying to make? They were sometimes the result of capture at sea, sometimes they were indeed destined for the King of Spain. So overall, I think what I'm partly trying to suggest here, and I'm going to conclude in a moment, is that we should take family stories seriously, even if they're wrong, right? Even if the details of these stories are incorrect, and there wasn't any Admiral Hulse in the 17th century capturing paintings that were painted in the 18th century. These stories can tell us some truths about the way in which paintings moved around, for instance. So to try to bring this to some sort of conclusion, so during the early modern era, paintings moved in and out of Europe for many reasons. As I mentioned a little while ago, they traveled as diplomatic gifts. For example, Thomas Roe, who was England's first ambassador to the Mughal court, brought a number of paintings as presents for the Emperor Jahangir, along with a velvet-colored carriage and a variety of other goods that were intended to oil the wheels of diplomatic relations between England and this, the important Mughal state. Although in Ambassador Rowe's estimation, these gifts did almost nothing to enhance England's reputation in the eyes of the Mughals. And he wrote back, with outrage, he wrote back to the East India Company who had supplied these goods. He said, "Your pictures are not all worth 1 penny. In Surat are nothing esteemed but the best sorts, good cloth and fine and rich pictures. They are coming out of Italy overland and from Ormuz, so that they laugh at us for such as we bring." So, it didn't work, perhaps, but that was the aim, that it should be a diplomatic gift. Paintings, of course, were also commodities. In the same years that Rowe was complaining about the poor quality of the English gifts to the Mughal court and blaming the East India Company for their poor sense, the East India Company was also shipping over 100 European paintings on a variety of themes to the Japanese port of Hirado in the, as it proved, largely mistaken belief that these would prove attractive to Japanese consumers. So diplomatic gifts as commercial endeavors, and speculative trade and diplomacy also brought out artworks from outside of Europe into Europe. So in these same years, Japanese elites were gifting paintings to English aristocrats, just as the English were taking them to the Mughal court. And in the same years of the early 17th century, the East India Company was not just sending English paintings to Japan in the hopes of making some money. They were also importing into Britain things like painted Japanese screens and other painted artworks as consumer ventures that they hoped English consumers would buy. Meanwhile, also circulating art were religious orders who were sending paintings on religious themes all around the world to decorate missions and churches in many different parts of the world. And scholars have rightly stressed the ways in which evangelization and diplomacy and the expansion of trade moved artworks around the early modern world, but much less attention is focused on the role of endemic military warfare in circulating artworks in and out of Europe. In a very fine book from 2018 called Art and War in the Pacific World, the art historian Joanne Mancini argued that closer attention to inter-imperial war may enhance the interpretation of processes related to art and material culture. War, she suggested, stimulated artistic activity when prize money was used to purchase paintings or to commission commemorative objects. So she looks at the way in which money might be used not just to buy a mansion in Bedfordshire, but then to furnish it with artworks and things like that. But war also transferred artworks between European imperial powers. And in this period, capture at sea provided regular opportunities for the unanticipated movement of paintings to new owners. And in particular, capture at sea brought artworks from colonial Spanish America into England, and it helps to explain their presence in British collections. In 2021, and I think this is a second quote, another art historian, Matthias Biffis, noted that the actual mechanics of mobility, literally how things moved from one place to another, had attracted relatively little attention from art historians. The art historian Jennifer Roberts, one of the people who has paid attention to this, has also likewise noted that scholars have not generally theorized the movement of pictures in a clunky and literal sense, nor, she wrote, have they attended to the material costs of transporting images, the delays, the resistances, the losses. So by paying attention to those mechanics of how things actually move from one place to another, and specifically to those moments of delay, resistance, and loss, to those moments when artwork slipped out of one trajectory into another, when movement was delayed, when images were lost, I think we better appreciate the role of war in moving art around the early modern world. Campaigners for the restitution of artworks have rightly challenged museums to explain how objects have ended up in their collections. But even when objects are not caught up in debates about return and restitution, asking why they are where they are can shed light on the ways in which art circulated and, as I've been trying to suggest here, at times went astray. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca, for such a really rich talk. Can people hear me? Okay. We've got a little bit of time for questions, if anybody would like to ask them. Oleg is going to be running around with a microphone. Any questions to kick us off? Yes.
Just thanks so much. That was such a fascinating and interesting talk. I've just sort of, could you speak a little bit more, and this is from a kind of place of ignorance, but do we know anything more about how these artworks were valued when they were like snatched and were a part of booty? Did people want the art? Did they, when it was distributed, did that happen in the courts, or did it happen kind of amongst the privateers who stole them? Do we get like a kind of sense of like, are privateers also kind of like art connoisseurs? Are they is there a sense of connoisseurship happening? Do we know?
Yeah, so there's lots of things to be said about that. So I mean, thinking about, I'll try not to say lots of things so that I don't end up filling up all the space with it. But certainly, as I think the woman who's now left was asking, them, artworks could be valuable commodities, particularly actually the frames sometimes are worth more than the pictures. And so it's sort of, inventories will often explicitly say, 2 cases of pictures richly framed, right? Because the frames could be worth more than the picture. But in terms just of the aesthetics of men at sea, so of course nobody went to sea hoping they would capture a picture. I mean, that was not what any pirate or anyone else dreamed of. You know, they wanted the fungible stuff, they wanted the gold and the silver and things like that. And in the case of enormous captures like the Santiago Apostol with its millions of pesos of gold and silver, that was what the Spanish ambassador wanted back, right? He really didn't have any interest in the 7 paintings that were also on the ship. But there's plenty of evidence that sailors, I mean, like everybody, have an aesthetic sense, right? And there's some interesting examples of sailors of one sort or another demonstrating their interest and appreciation for artwork, sometimes in rather heterodox ways. I mean, I should back up for a minute and say, of course, it shouldn't be a surprise that men at sea might be interested in artworks. And we have lots of evidence in the form of Scrimshaw, for example, of creating artworks that you scratch onto ivory and other forms of walrus tusk or things like that, which is a distinct maritime art form. Lots of people, lots of sailors painted and sketched. And we have lots of evidence of people on ship being of sailors, not just passengers or officers, being interested in art. But here's one example of the appreciation of artworks by ordinary seamen. So there was a court case in the 17th century, so therefore we know about this event, because the Spanish artist Zurbarán, in the 17th century artist, who did a good trade selling things to Spanish America, and at one point he got involved in a lawsuit that a set of pictures that he'd sent to Panama had arrived in very poor condition, and he took the ship's captain to court for not having looked after his paintings properly. And the ship's captain made a whole series of explanations for why these pictures were damaged, that they hadn't been packed properly, that it was water damage, etc. But one of the other people who was interviewed said, sort of revealed what had truly happened. And he said, oh, well, they were probably damaged during the fiesta. And it turned out that while at sea, the captain had decided to hold a fiesta on board the ship, and he had decorated the deck with these pictures, which had been hung from the rigging. And the sailor said that was probably when they got damaged. So we have an image of a ship that was made more festive for a celebration by including what was actually part of the cargo. So there is plenty of evidence of the appreciation. In terms of how they were valued when they get to Britain,
Carry on, please.
I mean, I've also been quite interested in what people thought about these pictures. Very often they were, despite it sort of being known that they had come from Latin America, were often described as being by Golden Age Spanish artists like Velázquez. So there's sort of a dual appreciation of them, or that maybe they were not by Murillo, one of the great other Golden Age artists, but they were by a son of Murillo who'd gone to Mexico. So they were sort of incorporated into the corpus of Spanish art in ways that actually make sense if you think about how people in Britain in the 19th century, example, thought about Spanish art. So I hope that gives you some sort of answer.
Fantastic. I can see Joanna and then Laura.
So, well, first, thank you very much for a really lovely paper. It just opens up such lovely avenues. I had two thoughts which I just wondered if you could sort of say a bit about. The first about is how the narrative you've offered us makes much more complex and adds new problems to the thing about where art objects belong and how they're appropriated and go across cultures. I think that seems to me to be very interesting, you know, when we worry so much now. I mean, I think that last example you gave, for example, of art that might in some respects have been described as, quote, colonial, unquote, that is made invisible by saying, no, it's Velázquez, it's Murillo. So there's something going on there which is worth thinking about. And I would think you must have some thoughts about that. And that links to my second area of thought, which was about the next stage after these art objects have been acquired and hung in various houses. Are they hung in places where they're going to be seen? Are they like the art objects that come back from the Grand Tour and publicise the status, the culture, the reputation of the people who own them? Are they in places in the house where they will be seen by a public, or are they more private? I think what's the role they're playing in British culture once they're in the houses of the Chumleys or whoever would be something would be the next question I might be asking.
Yeah, also really very interesting. So these things move around, and over the course of the 19th century, they become generally demoted from, you know, being interesting. People stop describing them as by Velázquez, and they get hung in the back stairwell. So there's a sort of downward process. A very nice example of this is a set of paintings from early 18th century Mexico that about 10 years ago were discovered in the basement of the Leicester City Art Museum. So there's a set of casta paintings, which are a distinctive type of 18th century Spanish-American artwork that I will not go on to a tangent describing what these things are, but they're a very distinctive type of artwork. And what is probably the earliest example of this genre also turns out to have been in Britain, hanging in stately homes in the 18th century. But in the mid-19th century, the set of paintings was given to the Leicester City, the art museum that had been established in Leicester, by the city's mayor. And they were initially hung in the library of the museum as they were in fact the first works of art the museum acquired, and they were hung in a public gallery where lectures were held, and they were intended to adorn and beautify this public space. So they were seen very much as being art for the public. That was kind of the last they were then ever seen until they were rediscovered in 2010, because after about 10 years, they were out of the library, they were in storage, and there's no evidence they were ever hung, and they were reclassified effectively as ethnographic. Yeah. So once they stopped being Golden Age art, they weren't really art at all. So there was sort of a trajectory that these artworks often go on, that I think, speaks to regimes of value over this period and to the place of Latin American artwork within British collections. I guess then the question of where do things belong is, it all depends on what you think they are. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I mean, there's lots of very interesting work by art historians trying to look at composite objects and things that were artworks that were made in different places involving all sorts of different inputs, and saying, well, where is it from? And the singular point of origin sort of evaporates when you then think about that. And that maybe can be true even with something that does have a single point of origin, but has varied meanings as well.
Thanks, Rebecca. Laura, do you still have a question?
Yes, I do.
You might have a microphone in a minute as well. So.
Thank you very much for your absolutely wonderful paper. I think this connects with the questions that we've already had. I hope I'm right, but I think what you've presented to us in terms of the evidence is artwork that has been produced by recognised, named artists, and you've said already that they become part of the Spanish Golden Age, the production of paintings by people who are recognised as artists. But I wondered if you could say a little bit more about whether contemporaries have any value for art that is by indigenous artists, or we don't know who it's from. Can you extend out of paintings to objects, perhaps? Is there any evidence whatsoever that there is a process of discernment going on when these cargoes end up in the places where they're not meant to be?
Yeah, also, that's, again, a really good question. So the painting, for example, that... this one, the one that was on the Santiago Apostol, the Spanish ship that was captured by the French ship that was captured by the British ship. So this picture, the one that we don't know what it looks like because we don't know where it is, but maybe it looks like that. This picture was, so I mean that's just another picture of the plaza, but we can use it as a placeholder. This painting was ascribed to an untutored native of Peru in the auction catalog and in the descriptions of it, and I know who bought it, and so we can say a little bit about. I have some idea of who might have painted it, but certainly British auction goers didn't have any idea. And this painting, with no provenance other than being by some Peruvian indigenous artist, sold for I don't know, I think it sold for £8 in the auction, which is not a lot of money. I mean, it's not a trivial sum, but it was not considered a great piece of art. It was considered a curiosity, and it was described, as it says here, as extremely curious. So, and the same ship had lots and lots of earthenware and ceramic objects, probably by indigenous artists, which again were simply described as cases of antiquities or things like that, rather than being described the way cases of antiquities being imported from Italy, for example, might have been described as an extremely valuable statue of Venus, And so there's quite a distinct difference between artworks that were thought to have been painted or produced by indigenous artists. To some extent, an exception might be in the early 16th century, codices from Latin America had a great value in 16th century Europe. They were considered really interesting and important, were vigorously collected all over Europe. That was not the case to the same degree by the early 19th century. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but yeah, that's...
Because I have the microphone. Yeah, thanks so much for the fascinating talk. And I was thinking, because I was just for another Festival of Ideas event yesterday, which was on Japan and kind of the first kind of English arriving in Japan. And one of the things that the first Englishmen arriving in Japan around 1600 ran into was that the words for English and pirate were the same to the Japanese. It may be the Spanish and Portuguese that were, kind of feeding them this information. But what made me think about, because as you say, these ships are being, captured between these different countries. And I was just wondering, are there equivalents to this in Spain, in the Netherlands, or anywhere else of this kind of captured at sea and this kind of history of these objects? Do we see this in stately homes or things like that in these countries?
Yeah, that's again very interesting. So there are examples of artworks that were captured elsewhere, brought into Spain, and then flowed through Spanish collections. So one of these captures is the case of a ship called the Westmoreland, which in the mid-18th century was sailing from Italy back to Britain with the collections of half a dozen, if not a dozen, British grand tourists, these wealthy young men who went on the grand tour. It was an opportunity to, supposedly improve their education and get away from home and, drink a lot and things like that, and purchase art, which is part of what you were supposed to do. And so this ship was packed full of the purchases of all of these grand tourists, and it was captured by a French privateer, but ended up in Spain, and all of the artwork remained in Spain. It ended up through a peculiar set of circumstances as the property of the Spanish Grocers Guild, who did a whole bunch of stuff with this artwork, but which then sort of it flowed all through Spain. So there certainly are examples of artworks ending up in Spanish collections in that way. What there's a really large, interesting, growing new scholarship on is not so much about capture at sea, but about the very large presence of art from colonial Spanish America in private collections in Spain itself. So these were often things that were, they went exactly where they were being sent. They were being sent back from Latin America to Spain. But Spanish art historians of Spain are only really beginning to catalog this stuff and realize how incredibly prevalent this stuff is all over the place. So there's a whole other topic about that as well, which is tracking simply the presence of colonial artworks in the peninsula.
Well, I also have a microphone, as it happens.
You're not afraid to use it.
Well, a little afraid, but we'll go with it anyway. I was really interested in, you were talking a bit about how people tried to protect artwork as it was being transferred across, and to what extent sort of instructions were written trying to explain what people were supposed to do with it. I mean, obviously don't put it up for a fiesta, presumably. I mean, because I was particularly thinking, looking at natural history specimens, particularly the 18th century, there is a lot of concern. There are very specific instructions from the Spanish crown about this is how you stuff a jaguar, this is how you stop this plant from dying en route. There's one really exciting example where they have this live caiman and its mouth is obviously all bound up and they're trying to say this is how you get it out of the box without it killing you. So I was wondering again, what were instructions kind of circulated? Obviously you couldn't stop yourself being plundered at sea necessarily, but in terms of actually storage and keeping the art in good condition, what kinds of sort of instructions were circulated, if any?
So very different from the kinds of scientific expeditions that you've written so much about, where there was an interest from the highest level, from the Spanish crown, in making sure that plant specimens or animals, or etc., came back intact. So there was certainly, to my knowledge, nothing from the Spanish crown saying this is how you pack a painting, but it was dealers who did this. And there is a lot of stuff. Do you roll the picture so that the painting is the paint is on the inside or the outside? What do you do to make sure that it doesn't get wet? How do you pack it? I mean, there's a lot of stuff in dealers' letters about this, but not in terms of formal instruction. That's really because there isn't the same level of state interest.
And interesting that it's
or scientific interest.
Yeah. It's really fascinating. Any further questions before we go and adjourn for a glass of wine?
Adjourn for a glass of wine.
In which case, can we thank Rebecca again for a really wonderful, stimulating talk?